Hello, my name is Steve O'Reilly, and welcome to Roma Locuta Est Considers. This is a production of the Roma Locuta Est blog and website. What is the RomaLocutaEst.com blog and website? You might well ask yourself. It's a wee humble blog that the world little notes, nor will it long remember, but it's devoted to apologetics and commentary on Catholic topics, current events, and general Christian apologetics. We here at Roma Locuta Est, we do not accept donations. No funding is received from any source. We're beholden to no one. We alone are responsible for the content. This is episode 7 of Roma Locuta Est Considers. Today we continue our look at Benepapism, and today we'll take a look at Canon 17 and its place in this controversy. Okay, and as you know, the dispute here at the core of Benepapism, the claim that Benedict's resignation was invalid, is looking at the Declaratio, Benedict's official instrument of resignation, and this is just a segment from it, where Benedict said, "For this reason, and well aware of the seriousness of the act, and with full freedom I declare and renounce the ministry," or ministerio, and here he used the Latin ministerio, the Bishop of Rome, successor of St. Peter, in such a way the See of Rome, the See of St. Peter, will be vacant, and a conclave to elect a new Supreme Pontiff will have to be convoked by those whose competence that is. And the core of the controversy here, at least for the Benepapist, is that they looked at the word ministerio in Latin that Benedict used here, that he resigned the ministerio. The Benepapists raised the objection, looking at Canon 332, subparagraph 2, where it says, if it should happen, the Roman Pontiff resigns his office. And here, in the Code of Canon Law, the word actually used is munus. And so the Benepapists say, aha, the Code of Canon Law says munus here, but it says ministerio in the resignation document. So in their view, that means since he resigned the ministerio and did not resign the munus, therefore his resignation is invalid. By way of a little background, you may recall, if you have followed this series thus far, we've looked at the question of the munus versus the ministerium, and we've looked at various arguments that debunk the Benepapist claims that ministerium could not or should not be used. But specifically here, to set the stage for looking at Canon 17, we're going to revisit just real quickly the question of Lumen Gentium 20. You may recall that in one of our previous episodes, we looked at Lumen Gentium 20, where we showed that it teaches or shows that a munus is a ministerium. This insight came to me via Father John Rickard, as I mentioned before in the series, via private correspondence. That argument made its way into my book, Valid, The Resignation of Pope Benedict XVI, and that book is available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and other fine booksellers and distributors. Now, that initial insight, the munus is a ministerium, also I further developed in an article on my blog, Roma Locuta Est, and the name of that article is Lumen Gentium Destroys Benepapism in Toto. And you can find that article at this website. You just type that in and you'll find it. And then in turn, this article became the basis for episode 4 of Roma Locuta Est Considers Munus versus a Ministerium, part 3 of 5, and you can just find that on, I guess, my YouTube channel, episode 4, and this is the URL for it right here. Again, we're just setting the stage to look at Canon 17 and its place in the controversy here. But first, I'll just summarize the argument that I just spoke of regarding Lumen Gentium. So here, the argument against Benepapist from Lumen Gentium in a nutshell. So if you remember back in episode 4, or please refer back to it to look at it in greater detail, but just briefly, in that we saw in Lumen Gentium 18, the Council Fathers spoke of Christ the Lord instituted in his church a variety of ministries. And in the Latin, it uses the word form of ministerium, varia ministeria instituit, right there. So Christ the Lord instituted in his church a variety of ministries. And still in Lumen Gentium 18, immediately following that, where it says Christ instituted various ministries, the Council Fathers go on to kind of list out in the subsequent verses or subsequent lines of Lumen Gentium 18 what those various ministries in fact are. They mention the apostles, they mention the bishops, and they mention the role of Peter, the Petrine ministry. And then, again, we started in Lumen Gentium 18, and as you progress through the paragraphs from Lumen Gentium 18 onwards, this is chapter 3 in Lumen Gentium, you get to Lumen Gentium 20, where they talk about the transmission of offices, what will happen after the death of the apostles. So the Council Fathers talk about they, Peter and the apostles, therefore appointed such men and gave them the order that when they should have died, other approved men would take up their ministry. The word here in Latin is ministerium. So here we're talking about the transmission of the ministerium onto others. And then the very next line is as follows. We'll just repeat that line again, the one from the prior slide. They, which obviously refers to Peter and the apostles, therefore appointed such men and gave them the order that when they should have died, other approved men would take up their ministry. Well, what are those ministries, right? That's going to be the apostolic ministry and the Petrine ministry. And the word here is used, ministerium, in Lumen Gentium 20. The very next line in Lumen Gentium 20 reads as follows. Among those various ministries, again, these are the ones that men will take up after their death, among those various ministries, and again, the word ministeria is used here, ministerium, which according to tradition were exercised in the church from the earliest times, the chief place belongs to the munus of those appointed to the episcopate by succession running from the beginning or the passers on of the apostolic seed. So here it talks about the apostles passing on their offices onto the bishops, but also another line or two down from there, it talks about the Petrine munus. So it speaks of Peter and the Petrine munus. That's what's being passed on. The ministries being passed on are the episcopal munus and the Petrine munus. So let's just pause here to reflect on the significance of all this. Again, Lumen Gentium, what it's really saying here, or what it has said that's relevant to our discussion of the munus and the ministerium relative to Benedict's resignation. It's saying a munus is a ministerium. It's quite clear. Again, up here, Lumen Gentium 20, it talks about Peter and the apostles appointed such men and gave them the order that when they should have died, other men should take up their ministry or ministerium. Then immediately following that says, among these ministries, the chief place belongs to the office of the munus, of those appointed to the episcopate. So a munus is a ministerium. Okay, so it talked about the chief place belongs, the office of the munus of those appointed to the episcopate. In Gentium 20, another 2 or 3 verses down from that, after it's talked about the place of the episcopate, it talks about Peter and the Petrine munus. It literally talks about the munus, the Petrine munus. So again, so we're talking about men who are taking up their ministry, and among these ministries are the munus of the episcopate and the munus of Peter, the Petrine munus. So we know a munus is a ministerium, and we also know that the Petrine munus is identical to the Petrine ministerium. So let's kind of put all this together. We've seen that a munus is a ministerium. We've seen that that among the ministries is the office of the bishop. And among the ministries being passed on is also the Petrine Munus. And we know that the Petrine Munus is identical to the Petrine Ministerium. That's what's getting passed on. Therefore, if one resigns the Petrine Ministerium, one necessarily resigns the Petrine Munus. So therefore, with Benedict resigning the Petrine Munus, the ministry of the Bishop of Rome, successor of St. Peter, he necessarily resigned the Petrine Munus. Okay, then comes the Benepapist objection. I had posted essentially that argument, which was in an article of mine from my blog. I had posted it in the comments section underneath one of Brother Bagnolo's articles on his blog. I posted that in the comments section, and he posted an objection to that. And Brother Bagnolo's objection also appeared in the comment section of below his article and below my posting of my link. But he refers to Canon 17, and I'll in a second here I'll show you what his exact verbatim objection was. But he appeals to Canon 17, as you'll see. What does Canon 17 say? Canon 17 says ecclesiastical laws must be understood in accord with the proper meaning of the words, considered in their text and context. If the meaning remains doubtful and obscure, recourse must be made to parallel places, if there are such, to the purpose and circumstances of the law and to the mind of the legislator. The bold letters, I put that there. That's not in the original. Okay, so then here comes Brother Bagnolo's objection. I cited down here Brother Bagnolo's comment above was part of his response to me in his article, below his article in the comments section. You can put it on pause if you want to find the exact links there. But his objection here, and that the objection, the part of it we will focus on here, is again, these are Brother Bagnolo's words. But one cannot appeal to the Latin text outside of the Code of Canon Law, because Canon 17 forbids that cases where the code is clear, as it is in Canon 145, where alone in all the canons, officium is defined as a munus, not a ministerium. Okay, so let's take a look. That's the core part of Brother Bagnolo's objection that we'll look at in this video presentation. So let's take a look at that. Okay, so I put Brother Bagnolo's objection up here at the top, and I'll just read it again. But one cannot appeal to any Latin text outside of the Code of Canon Law, because Canon 17 forbids that in cases where the code is clear, as it is in Canon 145, where alone in all the canons, officium is defined as a munus, not in a ministerium. So, stepping back for a second, what you can see here, what Brother Bagnolo is saying, that here in the argument that I had posited and had linked on his website, which appealed to Lumen Gentium in Latin, he's saying, no, you can't do that, Steve, because Canon 17 forbids that. So we'll take a look at that in greater detail, but before we get into that part of his objection, let's take a closer look here where it says, where the Code of Canon Law is clear, as it is in Canon 145, where alone in all the canons officium is defined as a munus, not a ministerium. Let's just take a quick look at that claim first. And to look at that claim, let's just read what Canon 145 says. An ecclesiastical office, officium in the Latin, is any function, munus in Latin, constituted in a stable manner by divine or ecclesiastical ordinance to be considered for a spiritual purpose. So again, so he's saying this is where Canon 145 is defining what officium is as a munus. It's not as a ministerium, and therefore I think the point Brother Bagnolo is trying to say is that we're kind of stuck with that definition. Okay, so what do we say to that? To claim that Canon 145 is where alone all the canons officium is defined as a munus, not as a ministerium, this is a misleading statement, certainly in my opinion. I'm not reading into Brother Bagnolo's intentions, but I do find it very misleading. Why? Because the Benepapist analysis here neglects the issue is not Canon 145 or whatever definition it gives to officium relative to munus. The issue remains, and the issue before us is whether Canon 332 either requires a specific word munus to be used or prevents other synonyms which entail the munus from being used. That's the issue. Okay, so that's at a high level, but again, looking specifically at Canon 145. To say officium or office is a munus, that does not preclude the possibility that either officium or munus may be defined in other words, such as ministerium. And we've already seen that munus and ministerium are synonyms. We've seen this in highly respected resources such as Lewis and Short. We've seen that the meanings of ministerium and munus overlap. Ministerium, in fact, includes office in its meanings. We've seen this in Lewis and Short, Stelton's Dictionary of Ecclesiastical Latin, and we've also seen this in practical examples, such as in the Acta Apostolicae Sedis, or the AAS, as it's abbreviated. And in there, we'd seen, courtesy of an article written by Father John Rickert, where he pointed out that the official entry in the AAS, again, the official journal, official chronicle of the Apostolic See, the official title of the Declaratio is a Declaratio of the Supreme Pontiff on the Muneris Episcopi Romae Successoris Sanctae Patri Abdicatione. All you Latin scholars, forgive me for mangling the office, but what that means, or how you translate that is a declaration of the Supreme Pontiff on the abdication of the office, munus, of the Bishop of Rome, successor of St. Peter. That's the title of the Declaratio in the AAS. So that's the title, and below it, it does use the word ministerium, speaking of where Benedict says he declares he renounces the ministry or ministerio of the Bishop of Rome, successor of St. Peter. So you have munus used in the title, ministerium used below it in the text. So the title points to the meaning of the text below it, so it's clear the words were being used synonymously. So we've seen all this. And all those examples above that I referred to, that could be seen on episode 2, part 2 of 5 of this series on munus versus the ministerium. Okay, so we just looked at kind of like the second part of the objection about Canon 145, but let's look at the meat of the objection, which is, again, from Brother Bagnolo, but one cannot appeal to any Latin text outside of the Code of Canon Law because Canon 17 forbids that in cases where the code is clear, as in the case of Canon 145, where alone in all the canons, officium is defined as a munus, not in a ministerium. So the objection here is that you can't look at anything outside the Code of Canon Law. The Code of Canon Law is the only place, the allegation seems to be here, that you can look at the Latin of any definition, especially if it's clear in the Code of Canon Law. That is the meat of the objection. So let's look at Canon 17 again. We looked at it earlier, but let's take a look at it again before we reply to it. Ecclesiastical laws must be understood in accord with the proper meaning of the words considered in their text and context. If the meaning remains doubtful and obscure, recourse must be made to parallel places, if there are such, to the purpose and circumstances of the law and to the mind of the legislator. Okay, that's Canon 17. Now, I want to give another shout out here to Father John Rickert. When I was drafting my response to Bagnolo, I ran it past Father Ricker. Then he pointed out some things. I thought that's probably good to add to the article. So again, shout out to him. And this is applying some logic to what Brother Bagnolo was saying. If you look at his objection up here, we can kind of dissect it. Again, his objection was, but one cannot appeal to any Latin text outside the Code of Canon Law because Canon 17 forbids that in cases where the code is clear. So what's another way of kind of restating that? Again, these are not, down here are not Bagnolo's words. This is kind of paraphrasing what he is, in effect, though, essentially saying. So if you take Bagnolo's objection, he reads into the second sentence of the canon to essentially mean the following. And the second sentence of the canon is, if the meaning remains doubtful or obscure, recourse must be made in parallel places. And Bagnolo's interpretation of that, to get to his objection, appears to be, if the meaning is unclear, one must consult parallel passages. But if the meaning is clear, it is forbidden to consult parallel passages. So in that case, that would be Bagnolo saying that, oh, it's clear, look at Canon 145, officium is a munus, and therefore it's clear, therefore you can't look. You're forbidden to look at Lumen Gentium and its Latin. That's essentially what he is saying. But there are three problems with Bagnolo's interpretation here. All right, so at the top of the page we have Bagnolo's objection. Again, one cannot appeal to any Latin text outside the Code of Canon Law because Canon 17 forbids that in cases where the code is clear. And again, we see here that Bagnolo reads the second sentence of the canon to essentially mean the following. Again, the second sentence of the canon is, if the meaning remains doubtful and obscure, recourse must be made to parallel passages or places. Bagnolo appears to interpret that as follows. Again, these are not his words, but what seems to be the clear implication of what his interpretation means. If the meaning is unclear, one must consult parallel passages. But if the meaning is clear, one is forbidden to consult parallel passages. And again, Bagnolo says that explicitly up here. Because the Code of Canon Law, because Code 17 forbids that in cases where the code is clear. He says that up there. So there are three problems with Bagnolo's interpretation that we just looked at right here. And we'll look at the first problem. The first, it should appear quite obvious if you look at the implication of his interpretation. It is an unjustified and unreasonable conclusion to say it is forbidden to consult parallel passages in cases where the meaning is clear. Because the conclusion here, it is forbidden to consult parallel passages, it does not follow from the antecedent if condition, which is if the meaning is clear. This is fallacious reasoning. This is the fallacy of denying the antecedent. Okay, so we looked at the first of three problems with Bagnolo's interpretation. All right, let's take a look at number two. Okay, so let's continue on with the second problem with Bagnolo's interpretation. Again, we have this paraphrase of really what he's getting at. If the meaning is clear, one must consult. If the meaning is clear, one cannot, one is forbidden to consult. And the problem here with this is that as you move from one set of if conditions to the second, clear and unclear are certainly negations of each other, or unclear or clear is a negation of the one above it. But to say someone must consult something, that's a command. The negation of a command is not another command to forbid one from doing that. The logical negation of there being a command, such as one must do something or one must consult, the negation is not a prohibition against doing it. It is simply there is no command. In other words, one may or may not do it. That would be the proper negation of a command that you must consult to. You don't have to. You can if you want. That would be the negation. Thus, a proper understanding of the canon is, if the meaning is clear, one may or may not consult parallel passages. So again, I want to give a shout out to Father Rickert for the thoughts behind those first two problems with Bagnolo's interpretation. Now on to the third problem with Bagnolo's interpretation. Again, his objection is, but one cannot appeal to any Latin text outside the Code of Canon Law because Canon 17 forbids that in cases where the code is clear. And again, we see how that's really applied to his interpretation of the second sentence of the canon. And that second sentence is, if the meaning remains doubtful and obscure, recourse must be made to parallel places. Bagnolo, again, kind of paraphrasing his understanding of that, it clearly is the case that in his mind, if the meaning is unclear, one must consult parallel passages, but if the meaning is clear, one is forbidden. One cannot consult anywhere else. So in response to that, I think the problem with Bagnolo's interpretation up here is the fact that canon law commentaries actually contradict his interpretation. All right, so let's see how a canon law commentary actually contradicts what Bagnolo is saying and actually refutes what he's saying. And here I am looking at the new commentary on the Code of Canon Law. It's by John Beale and others. It's a great resource. I suggest you get it if you're interested in matters such as this or canon law in general. Bagnolo again is saying, but one cannot appeal to any Latin text outside of the Code of Canon Law because Canon 17 forbids that in cases where the code is clear. All right, so what does the commentary say? Again, this is from Beale and others. If the meaning of the law is not clear from the text and context, the canon directs the interpreter of the law to make recourse to parallel places if they exist, to the purpose and circumstances of the law, and to the mind of the legislator. Actually, these additional steps are a necessary part of any thorough scholarly interpretation of the law. While examining the text and the context of the law is usually sufficient for applying the law in practical situations, the process delineated in the second sentence of the canon is always necessary for good doctrinal interpretation. The more thorough examination and explanation of the law is illuminating, even if the law's meaning is not doubtful and obscure. So he's saying you should still do it, even if it is not doubtful or obscure. So what can we conclude from this commentary from Beale and others from the new commentary on the Code of Canon Law? We saw the canon earlier, and now we're seeing the commentary. So our first conclusion or observation is clearly there is nothing in Canon 17 which forbids looking at parallel passages, even if one thinks the meaning is clear. It says right here, even if the law's meaning is not doubtful and obscure. So Bagnolo is rejected on that fact alone. All right, and the second point I'd make here is the canon law commentary confirms that the process delineated in the second sentence of the Code of Canon 17, and that second sentence was that even where that if the meaning is doubtful and obscure, that recourse must be made to parallel passages. So this is saying, though, canon law commentary confirms that the process delineated in that second sentence of Canon 17 is always necessary for good doctrinal interpretation. So you still want to do this anyway, is what the commentary is saying. So again, right here, it says right here in the commentary, while examining the text and context of the law is sufficient for applying the law in practical situations, the process delineated in the second sentence of the Code of Canon Law, sentence of the Canon 17, is always necessary for good doctrinal interpretation. And certainly that's the case when we're talking about whether or not someone's a pope or not, who's leading the church. So we should be looking very closely to make sure we get this right, that we're properly interpreting the canon. So again, Brother Bagnolo is dead wrong on this score as well. And then thirdly, the commentary further states, this more thorough examination and explanation of the law is illuminating, even if the law's meaning is not doubtful and obscure. It says it right here, this more thorough examination and explanation of the law is illuminating, even if the law's meaning is not doubtful and obscure. So here's another reason why we should still look at other sources outside, because we want a thorough examination, and that thorough examination might show that we were wrong. We might need to adjust our thinking. So again, Brother Bignolo's objection loses out on this observation as well. Okay, so we looked at Bignolo's objection. One cannot appeal to any Latin text outside the Code of Canon Law because Canon Law or Canon 17 forbids that in cases where the code is clear, which Brother Bignolo thinks is the case here. However, we've looked at some commentary on the Code of Canon Law that came from Beale and others, their new commentary on the Code of Canon Law. And then we've cited 3 clear observations from that commentary to show that Bignolo is just dead wrong, and anyone else who might share a similar opinion. And I'd probably put Stefania Acosta in that category. So looking at these 3 observations, therefore, in the case of a papal resignation, which is very publicly, very aggressively disputed by the Benepapists, they leave no doubt. They say Francis is definitely an anti-pope and Benedict was definitely the pope, and who by their public disputations are leading others into the risk of sin, error, and schism. It is certainly an occasion where when looking at parallel passages is not only advisable, it is absolutely necessary. So here we can see that just Brother Bignolo's objection is just dead wrong, both in terms of logic and in terms of canon law interpretation. Okay, we've gone through Brother Bignolo's objection regarding Canon 17 that he brought, and that is probably similar to the views of some other Benepapists out there in terms of appealing to Canon 17 or Canon 145. So let's look at a summation of our replies to this objection. Okay, first, we had looked at the Canon 145 part of the objection. And it's clear that while the canon may define office using the word munus, there's nothing here to say that either officium or munus cannot be defined in other ways or in other terms, such as using ministerium. And in that regard, we've already seen earlier in our series that Lewis in Short explicitly calls ministerium a synonym of munus. We've seen in Stelton's Dictionary of Ecclesiastical Latin that the words have overlapping definitions, even office being one of them. And then we saw in the Acta Apostolicae Sedis that the official entry for the Declaratio there has munus in the title, and we have ministerium below in the text. So the title points us to how we understand the text below it. So clearly, ministerium is being used in a synonymous sense to munus. So therefore, that would mean that Benedict's resignation is valid. And then we looked at Brother Bignolo's objection through the lens of logic. And there, again, hat tip to Father Rickert. And I'll say a little bit more about him at the end. But we saw as we looked at Brother Bignolo's understanding of the canon that his objection, in any Benepapist objection like that, is based on fallacious reasoning in the reading of the canon itself. It is an unjustified, unreasonable conclusion to say it is forbidden to consult parallel passages in cases where the meaning is clear. The conclusion, it is forbidden to consult parallel passages, does not follow from the antecedent if condition. This is fallacious reasoning. That's it's called the fallacy of denying the antecedent. Further, we saw that the logical negation of there is command, in other words, one must do this or one must consult in cases where it's unclear, the negation of that is not a prohibition against doing it. It is simply there is no command at all. So the proper way to really interpret the canon there is to say one may or may not do it. In cases where it's clear, one may or may not look at other parallel passages. Thus, the proper meaning or proper understanding of the canon is, again, as I said, if the meaning is clear, one may consult parallel passages. That's from logic. And then finally, we looked at Catholic law commentary, contradicts the objector, Brother Vignolo. We saw there's nothing in Canon 17 which forbids looking at parallel passages, even if one thinks the meaning is clear. Canon law commentary confirms that even in the case of clear meaning, the process delineated in the second sentence, and that's the second sentence that said when it's obscure and unclear, you must consult parallel passages. But the commentary says even in cases of clear meaning, the process delineated in that second sentence about must consulting is always necessary for good doctrinal interpretation. So you really should be looking at parallel passages if you're worried about doctrinal interpretation. And certainly that's the case when we're looking at a case of a disputed papacy, in the case of Benedict, at least in the minds of the Benepapists. The commentary states that this more thorough examination and explanation of the law is illuminating, even if the law's meaning is not doubtful and obscure. So that's just an outright explicit rejection of Brother Vignolo's objection. Therefore, in the case of a papal resignation, which is very publicly and aggressively disputed by the Benepapists, through public disputations, they're leading others into the risk of sin, risk of error, and risk of schism. It is certainly an occasion where looking at parallel passages is certainly advisable, and indeed, I would go on to say, definitely necessary as well. Thus, with regard to the objection that alleges one cannot appeal to any Latin text outside of the Code of Canon Law, because Canon 17 forbids that in cases where the code is clear, we can definitely say that this objection fails, and it fails miserably. Okay, so that we're winding down here at our look at Canon 17, just to kind of run through resources again that might be out there for those of you who are conflicted over the whole controversy, or have friends who've fallen into it, or relatives who've fallen into it, or maybe you fell into it and you're just looking for what the objections might be to test your belief. I challenge you to test your belief. There's my book out there right now, Valid, Resignation of Pope Benedict XVI. It's available on Amazon and other fine booksellers such as Barnes & Noble. I have my blog out there, Roma Locuta Est. There's a lot of articles out there on all aspects and questions related to Benepapism. Ryan Grant, who I've mentioned before, he's written a great article on Benepapism, or Benevacantism as he called it. He looked at some of the Latin issues related to that. There's Father John Rickert, who we've mentioned a few times already in our series. He's written 4 excellent articles on the William Briggs website. And I've also mentioned him in some other ways that where he had opined to me via private correspondence with me when I was writing my book, and had some great ideas that I included in the book or in a subsequent article, in this case related to Canon 17. I mentioned that along the way. And then there's Dr. Edward Fieser, who's written at least a couple articles on the topic as well that I would point people to. And finally, one more shout out to Father John Rickert, FSSP. Again, as you saw earlier in this presentation, where we introduced some logical criticisms of Brother Vignolo's interpretation of Canon 17. Hat tip to Father John Rickert there. He has written a book on visual logic, seeing classical and modern logic. I highly recommend this book to folks. It's available on Amazon. Okay, we're here. Final slide. So next video, it's going to be on Benepapism again. Continuing our look at it. This topic is going to be from a line from Benedict's last audience. I've been wanting to get to this line for quite some time, but it was important to address the munus versus the ministerium before now, and also to look at Canon 17. But the line from the last audience, spoken by Benedict XVI, his last audience the day before he actually resigned, is the line, "The always is also a forever." No other line perhaps has been so misused and abused by the Benepapists in this whole controversy. They are so wrong on this that they frankly ignore any argument to the contrary on this, and I hope you'll tune in and we'll see that. So for now, that's the end of this video on Canon 17. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you have enjoyed this series thus far. If you have, please hit the thumbs up if you like it. Please subscribe as well if you like it. If you don't like it, there's a little thumbs down button there too, I think you can hit. So feel free to hit that. I'm sure you will. But don't subscribe if that's the case. So again, thank you for your time and attention and your patience with me as I kind of go through these videos. Thank you.